Okay, structuralism.
Structuralism.
If a sonnet is the product of a kind of cultural factory, then it's actually the cultural factory that the structuralists are more interested in than merely the product itself. I'm going to give you two routes to understanding structuralism. First, the simple approach to understanding it. Second, the theoretical basis for structuralism as an approach to culture. I'm Dr. John, and let me start by saying that structuralism is an interpretive tool that has its origins in the theory of language. Now, language, as we know, is made up of words, and words have different meanings. But where does the meaning of a word lie? If you were to take a magnifying glass and look intensely at a word, you'll never find its meaning. Somehow the meaning of a word exists outside of the word. It exists in the difference, the gap between it and other similar words. I mean, a hut is slightly different from a shed, and a book is slightly different from a pamphlet or a magazine. The meaning comes to us by the existence of these subtle differences between words. We might also find harder binary oppositions to our words, such as day and night or hot and cold. It's important to reiterate that the meaning of a word exists in the gaps or differences between it and other words. So here's the simple explanation. To structuralists, the fact that meaning can be revealed by difference in the gaps or differences or oppositions from one term to a next, that principle can be applied to all of human culture. For structuralists, all of our cultural output, all of the fashion, the architecture, the literature, the theatre, the film, the advertising campaigns, all of these expressions can be read like a language, the meaning of which are not revealed by taking a magnifying glass and magnifying the internal components, but rather by taking a telescope and scanning across the entire cosmos outside of the work, looking for comparison, difference, and opposition. In other words, relationships. What are the relationships between this piece of culture and other types of culture? These relationships we term as structure, and we might think of them as things like genre and motifs and tropes. Now, it's interesting to note that this way of looking outside of the work for relationships, connections, differences, and oppositions is completely different from the prevailing school of criticism that there was at the time, which insisted that the best way of understanding or gaining meaning from a work is to look closely internally at the logic that exists within it. The principle of close reading is basically to take a sonnet or a novel and apply that magnifying glass approach to look internally at what's going on and the word selection and the metaphors used within the internal logic of that work, looking for meaning. What structuralists did is they looked consistently outside of the work for relationships and difference. Structuralists take a telescope and scan the entire cosmos of culture. So for those of you interested in the theoretical underpinnings of this, here we go. In the 1940s, a French anthropologist rediscovered the work of a Swiss linguist and gave us a new way of reading that involved engaging fully with the cultural, historical, and psychological underpinnings from which the work emerged. So structuralists assert that meaning lies outside the text. In that, meaning is something that we ascribe to a text, and human perception of the external world tends toward placing meaning within structure. In order to understand the kind of structures we mean, let's take an example. Sonnet 131, Shakespeare's sonnet. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. So instead of looking at the specific words, let's take out the telescope and scan the cosmos. The sonnet is numbered 131, so we know it's part of a sequence of sonnets. And sonnet sequences was a very early genre of English poetry that emerged around the late 15 and early 1600s. One of the emerging traditions of this genre was to list the beautiful attributes of the beloved woman to whom the sonnet is addressed. And then we might examine how is Shakespeare responding to this tradition. Instead of listing her beautiful attributes, he's almost suggesting that she's quite the opposite. So we have an element of opposition. We have the idea of beauty and non-beauty. He's essentially saying in the sonnet, she's not conventionally attractive, but I love her anyway, and therefore my love for her is perhaps stronger. So sonnet 131 becomes a subversion of what we'd normally expect in a love poem. We could look wider at the sonnet tradition that came from Italy 200 years before it became popular in England, with writers like Petrarch and Dante. Sonnets were very much part of literary culture in London in the late 1500s, so we know that sonnets were exchanged in manuscript form long before they ever were published, if they were published. And so then we start to look at another circle or cosmos or constellation within the cosmos of this culture, which is literary exchange, the idea of literary coteries. Another element of the structure could be that the way in that culture that beauty was understood. We might look at the differences between conventional beauty and the time-worn love based on deeper attributes, a kind of spiritual beauty. This is another concept or oppositional element that we might look at. So you can begin to see some of the cultural structures or practices that Shakespeare took part in, and you can see that we are actually straying further and further away from the text of the sonnet itself. We're moving from the text more towards the cultural structures, the constellation of cultural practices of which this sonnet is a part. If a sonnet is the product of a kind of cultural factory, then it's actually the cultural factory that the structuralists are more interested in than merely the product itself. Now, if this all looks like we are moving further and further away from the power of language and words, which we enjoy in literature, then you need to understand that the structuralists are working with a completely different theory of language. So in 1916, about 3 years after the death of Ferdinand de Saussure, the Swiss linguist, 2 of his students took the notes that they had taken from his lectures and they published them as a book. This is the Cours de linguistique générale. And in this work, Saussure said 3 things that set the structuralist thinking. First, this is a new channel, and every like and subscribe really counts. I'm always working on new tutorials and video essays on culture, so if this is your thing, hit the subscribe button. Please give me a like and give us a comment on what you'd like me to look at next. Okay, 3 things that Ferdinand de Saussure said that set the structuralist thinking. Number 1, that words and their meanings are arbitrary. Words and their meanings are clearly 2 different things. There's a relationship between them, but for Saussure, that relationship is arbitrary. If you take a magnifying glass to the word cat, you're never going to see anything that resembles a cat or gives you an indication that cat is its meaning. There's an association there, and that association for Saussure is very concrete. We can't escape the word and its meaning, but that meaning is a product of the repeated use that we make of the word. Other than a few onomatopoeic words like cuckoo and pop, there is no strict relationship or reason why a word has a specific meaning. But that meaning is there, is concrete for us. We can't think of the word or image of a tree without it representing a tree to us. It is our conventions, our repeated use that gives the word image and the thing that it signifies the strict relationship. For Saussure, language is a system of signs. A sign is a spoken or written word that has meaning. The signifier component of the sign is the word or image, spoken or drawn, and the signified is the concept or idea that it represents. These are indivisible for Saussure. We cannot conceive of the concept without incurring the word image, and vice versa. Number 2, the meaning of a word is relational. That is to say that we understand the words only by knowing the constellation of other words associated with it. Take the word book. For Saussure, we only really understand the meaning of the word book by understanding the subtle difference that exists in words associated with it. It's different, we know, from a letter, a pamphlet, a booklet, a volume, a tome, a library, and so on. It's by understanding these subtle differences that the meaning emerges. The famous example that Saussure used himself was the 8:25 Geneva to Paris train. He asks a question: what gives this train its identity? We know it's not the locomotive, the vehicle itself, or the cabins that it pulls, because they can be changed at any moment. But the train still has its 8:25 to Paris identity. It might not even be a train, there could be a bus service if there's a fault on the line. It's not really the 8:25 time itself, because of course it could run early or late. What gives the train its identity is that it's not the 7:25 nor the 9:25, it's the 8:25. That's what gives the meaning, the relationship or the difference between it and other versions of the same thing. The third thing that Saussure said that set the structuralists really thinking is that words, for us, language, is constitutive. The world as we experience it is experienced through the medium of language. Let's look at some quick examples. We know that in the spectrum of colours there's an infinite variety of colours. But in a rainbow we pick out 7 constitutive colours. They are the main or primary colours to us. We know that the 4 seasons don't really exist in nature, that's just how we term them, but we could easily say there were 6 or 8, especially these days. We also divide the week into 7 days. This is how we experience time, but of course in nature there are no 7 days. For Saussure, language helps us to navigate the infinite variety of reality. It's how we read the world. So, during the Second World War, a French anthropologist called Claude Lévi-Strauss was living in New York, and he was investigating myths, the myths that are told, stories of ancient history, how they are conveyed, what they mean, and why we tell them. Lévi-Strauss came across Saussure's work, and an idea struck him. What if we could apply these ideas about language being arbitrary, relational, and constitutive, and apply them to myths, to storytelling in general? What if myths could be read like a language? So instead of looking deeply into the Oedipus myth, as had Sigmund Freud, Lévi-Strauss decided to look outside of the myth for a wider context, for relationships and difference between elements of the myth and the wider storytelling practice. He became convinced that rather than looking deeply into the myth, if we widen our gaze, use a telescope to look across the constellation of culture, then we'll find a deeper meaning than's available to us if we look at the myth alone. This movement from the particular to the general is the key structuralist path. They look outside of the text for wider containing structures, constellations rather than individual stars, and toward things like genre, recurring themes, motifs, similarities, differences, and crucially oppositions, to find an overarching narrative structure. Once the idea of the sign and how it operates with its signifier and signified, once that concept had been freed from the world of linguistics, the structuralists used it to interpret almost everything. For example, fashion is a kind of language, a series of signs governed by certain rules. It has, in a way, a grammar, the meaning of which can really only be appreciated once a wider understanding of the system of clothing can be understood. In isolation, a cloak is merely a cloth, and when it's worn it could signify an elderly, cold woman. Until we add a crown, and then the cloak changes. It becomes something almost regal. Art, literature, theatre, film, advertising, architecture. There are signs always in operation throughout these cultural practices, and each sign can only really be understood, structuralists tell us, by broadening our awareness of the wider rules and norms of the structure within which the sign is operating. In Shakespeare's Henry V, before the Battle of Agincourt, the king disguises himself with an old cloak and goes among his troops to gauge their readiness for battle. When seen as a sign, rather than reading the king as a kind of spy, we could see that his act, a disguised king becoming a commoner, is reminiscent of God disguising himself as a human and coming among us as Jesus. a noble, kind of selfless way of testing and teaching his flock. And so structuralists might point to the religious theme in the king's actions. The theme you will hear when exploring structuralism is Roland Barthes. In his book Methodologies, published in Paris in 1957, he examined a number of cultural practices in France, such as drinking red wine or watching sports. And he used structuralist ideas to demonstrate that nothing is inert. Everything is laden with meaning once we widen the gaze and understand that culture is a system of signs and can be read like a language. And exploring wrestling, a theatrical sport with a predetermined outcome, he discovered a sign of good over evil, of moral order, and how it relates to stories of heroes and villains we're all inherently aware of from childhood. Wrestling becomes, for Roland Barthes, a type of language that we can read, if only we first understand it to be so, and then widen our gaze towards the larger structure of which it's a part. What structuralist critics do is uncover the hidden rules, the patterns, the grammar of the language that we're looking at. In Romeo and Juliet, they might explore the binary oppositions of love and hate, or they might explore the dual symbolism inferred by the balcony as a place both of secrecy and also exposure. Once we know that there are themes and scenes that plug into tropes, formats, types, and norms that have their own traditions, then a world of interpretive possibility opens up. As a structuralist, Roland Barthes probably went further than most in his use of structuralism as a tool. Later in his career, he entered a new phase, a post-structuralist phase, beginning with his 1968 paper, The Death of the Author, which I'll cover in a future video. But he also pushed the structuralist methodology to its extreme in his 1970 book, S/Z, in which he offers a critique of a short story. Barthes broke the story down into component parts in the same way a linguist would break down language, attempting to identify discrete units of meaning. He found 561 units in the story he calls lexes. And then by further identifying 5 codes which he saw as the basic underlying structures of all narratives. What's he really doing here? Well, if our culture, be it fashion or architecture or short stories, can be read like a language with meaning being revealed in the relationships between expressions, then the language of the short story could also have a grammar. It could have rules. And rather than us becoming mesmerized by the details and language of the story internally, we should be looking at the ways that all narratives work, that all short stories work. What is the grammar of a short story? The 5 codes, which he termed the grammar of a short story or the rules of the narrative structure, we can run through them quite quickly here. I won't go into detail. You can look them up. I have some notes in the description that will give you some further reading. But very quickly, the first one he called the proeretic code, which is the code that governs actions that imply further action will come. The second one is the hermeneutic code, which serves to create suspense and drama, such as the phrase, "She couldn't believe what she saw when she turned the corner, but she'd never forget it." We know that something is being encoded into the text there to give us a sense of suspense and anticipation. The third is the cultural code, when a sentence appeals to wider cultural knowledge that we all share, such as, "She was a day late and $1 short." We know that there's greater meaning in that phrase. Number 4, occasionally we might be struck by an author's choice of words that offer more than their literal meaning, showing additional insight into character or a setting, words that offer a flavor or intimation of something else. For example, it might be said that a character has a Swiss watch, inferring that they're interested in accuracy and precision. Or in Hamlet, when we read of fair Ophelia, It gives a suggestion of character more than appearance. This is what Barthes called the semic code, coming from the same root as semantic, semic. And lastly, the fifth code is the symbolic code. For Barthes, this refers to the dyads or binary oppositions in a text. We could see, for example, in Wuthering Heights, the difference between the cultured and educated Edgar and the more rural, naturalistic Heathcliff. Or we might see the two halves of Shakespeare's sonnets, those to the young man and those to the dark lady, as a binary opposition. For structuralists, these binary oppositions or dyads are key to how we organize and understand the world. With these five codes, what Roland Barthes is really attempting to do is to give us the rules of narrative structure, the grammar or the language of storytelling. Now, structuralism has been hugely influential as an interpretive tool in literary analysis and film analysis and general critical discourse. As with all interpretive tools, it has its strengths, but within a short period of time, it came to be challenged for some of its perceived weaknesses. Among these weaknesses is the assertion about the reliability of language as a structure or source of meaning, and the reliance on the apparently concrete binary oppositions and difference that post-structuralists began to question, and I'll show that in another video. As always, I've added further reading notes below, and the sources of where I got the information for this video. Really appreciate you watching. Thanks very much.